Thank you so much. We'll get back to that and try to find out also what's the different role of Egypt and Saudi Arabia will be in a changing region. But let's go to the outsiders, as it were, first. Ed, you've been the Assistant Secretary of State for Near East Affairs under James Baker at a time when we had high hopes for peace. You've been Ambassador to Syria, you have been Ambassador to Israel, and you have been dealing with the Middle East from the James Baker Center for Public Policy since you left the administration, and probably not always been happy when watching US policies towards the region. So from that distance of Houston, how do you see Washington coping with the changes in the Middle East?
Thank you, Volker. I'd like to pick up on something you said in the beginning of what Thierry said in his remarks about the definitional problem we may have with what we call as the Arab Spring or the Arab Awakening. And I have to confess to you all, I recently shared a podium with His Royal Highness, Prince Turki, and I referred to the Arab Awakening, and he looked at me and said, "Oh, I didn't realize I've been asleep all these years." So I will use the word Arab Spring, and I think that to try to characterize the United States administration's approach toward the Arab Spring, first, I don't think a coherent strategy has been formed. But in describing Washington's approach, I think we must think of two large categories or trends. One is American values and principles. We are, after all, a revolutionary country based on liberty, freedom, human rights, equality before the law, etc. And therefore, our approach as a country toward the Arab Spring is going to be defined in a large part toward the long arc of history in promoting these individual freedoms that America stands for. So I think this is one of the imperatives of American foreign policy toward the Arab Spring. The other one, frankly, are national security interests. And sometimes these will seem to conflict in what we do. But I agree very much with what Amr Moussa and Prince Turki have said, is that America must look at the Arab Spring in a differentiated manner. One size does not fit all. And I think if you analyze the recent actions of Washington, you can see this differentiation at work. For example, in Egypt, we worked very closely after President Mubarak's departure with the Egyptian military, with which we have had very close ties for many years. And I think that relationship was beneficial in perhaps helping the situation where the military became the transition toward, became the vehicle for political transition. In Tunisia, it was similar. In Libya, very famously, our then Secretary of Defense, Bob Gates, said, the United States does not have vital interests in Libya. Therefore, we are not going to take the leading role. We're going to look to our European partners, especially France and Britain and NATO, to take the lead. President Obama was criticized by his opponents in the United States for, quote, unquote, leading from behind. But I personally think that this was the right decision. The United States does not have to be in the lead on every one of these initiatives. Because if you look in the broader picture, the United States is still engaged very heavily militarily in Iraq. We're at the end game of Iraq, hopefully, and very heavily engaged militarily in Afghanistan. So it would be perhaps even reckless for the United States to go into another military venture in yet another Arab or Muslim country. So this policy of differentiation, I believe, will be a characteristic of no matter what administration is in office in Washington. Look at our approach toward Bahrain. It was basically rhetorical, urging the King of Bahrain to negotiate with, talk to, open a dialogue with the protesters, very conscious of two factors, that one of our closest allies in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, was supporting the regime in Bahrain, but at the same time, frankly, the headquarters of the United States Fifth Fleet is there in Manama, in Bahrain. So these are national security interests that obviously any president of the United States is going to have to carefully balance with what I call the long arc of history. And lastly, I think we're going to have to, as His Royal Highness said, reform is an imperative. How does a country like the United States, or France, or England, or Germany, from the outside, how do we approach viable, effective policies toward the Arab Spring? And I think there's going to be much more of a role for economic and social development rather than political alliances in order to, as Amr Moussa said, you cannot have political reform without having economic reforms. So therefore, they have to go in parallel. And I think that's where the outside world can probably help the specific Arab countries in terms of reform. And lastly, we must not forget the centrality of the political dialogue and narrative in the broader Middle East of the Palestinian issue and Arab-Israeli conflict resolution. I think that while this has not been in the forefront of the protesters in the streets of the Arab world, it could very well become a major issue that can foster the forces of radicalism in the Middle East from any side, secular or religious. And therefore, conflict resolution, especially of the Palestinian issue, I think has to be an imperative of American policy.
Thank you, Ed.